Good. Okay, so welcome everybody, and so I hope you recovered from the Catalan fest yesterday. Anyway, well, it's a great pleasure to have here Marc Toussaint, because, well, in a sense, in this summer school we have, in the second week, we have tackled this issue of goals and goal-directed cognition mostly from a biological perspective, and so we have seen goals, although they are represented in prefrontal cortex of humans and or monkey, and well, now we will probably take the same topic, but from a very different angle, from the angle of machine learning and robotics. So in a sense, in this field, an emerging perspective is that goal-directed choice and also planning, they can be cast as a form of probabilistic inference. And I think that Marc is really pioneering this field, and so we're really looking forward to hearing this nice topic.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this place. Yes, so today I wanted to talk. First, I'll give a brief interview of what the idea is actually, what the idea of reformulating planning problems and decision-making problems as inference problems, and then later on focus on one specific formalization that we came up with, which is related to stochastic optimal control. But I thought I'd start this talk with a little test and flip up some equations. So there will be equations in the talk somewhere.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. So you can see if you understand those. Good. Okay. Also to get an idea what things you already know. So do people recognize this equation up here? So hands up who knows that equation? A few. Not too many. Okay. So yes, so that's a traditional, maybe people would call it TD, so temporal difference equation from reinforcement learning. And that one here, I guess the same people would now lift their hands, right? Because this is just the version which is called Q-learning. And this one here, I would expect, I'd be surprised if people would raise their hand. Because one of the outcomes of that presentation is to explain to you this equation here, which is seemingly very related to traditional reinforcement learning equations, but it is actually different. And without going into detail yet, so that equation is the outcome of an alternative formulation of optimal control and reinforcement learning. And things like this are actually the motivation for reformulating the problem, because sometimes we're lucky, and from this reformulation we can actually derive different types of algorithms. And this one particularly I find very interesting, which I'm going to discuss much later why I find this interesting. It's an alternative model-free reinforcement learning equation, if you want to put it like that. So to give an outline, I'll organize that talk in three parts. The first part would be about the general idea of planning as inference, or reformulating planning as inference. And this will be quite non-technical. I just talk about the idea, try to get this across, and also talk about some previous work on this. I'm certainly not the first to pioneer this or so. The second part will have, will sort of make this much more rigorous for one specific case, which is the case of stochastic optimal control. I'll explain what it is. It's very closely, it's basically the same as Markov decision processes. And in the second part, I will really, with equations, derive what we actually mean by reformulating the problem as an inference problem, and also derive provably converging algorithms that sort of optimize this. So this will involve quite a lot of math, but yeah, we'll just go over this. And then the third part will then be focusing on a model-free version of all of this. So from this theory, we will be able to derive an alternative method, a model-free reinforcement learning algorithm, which I find very interesting, which I thought is worth explaining to you. So let me start with the first part and the general idea of planning as inference. So I think people agree now that it is possible to reformulate planning or control as probabilistic inference. And there's many different almost schools or perspectives on this. Some of them formulate ascorbic-Laplace minimization, as we will do, likelihood maximization, as we've done before, free energy minimization, which is actually the same as expectation maximization or model free. So let's just, I think people agree that this is possible, and you will see later that it is possible. But the question is, why are people actually interested in reformulating planning or control as an inference problem? And in thinking about that, well, I wanted to make some statements. The first is the motivation for doing this is not to solve problems, which we can already solve with Bellman view. So it's not really that we want to reformulate it just for the sake of reformulation, and then could hope that we can solve problems like normal reinforcement learning problems in finite MDPs, so better than with Bellman methods. And in fact, that's not the case. The motivation is actually, it's different points. So first, it is theoretically interesting. That's well, maybe you would agree, or maybe we'll see in the second part. The second point is that the motivation actually is that in some cases where the standard approaches to planning and control, which are very often inspired by the Bellman view, so recursing backwards some cost-to-go functions or value functions, if those methods have problems and cannot be done exactly, because it would be infeasible, or if we work on distributed representations, factored representations, these kind of things, then the reformulation sort of suggests alternative approximations. So the reformulations sometimes allow us to derive algorithms that are sort of structurally different in how they propose approximations to problems where the Bellman view would not be feasible. So that's the technical motivation, and a more interdisciplinary motivation would be that I think that these reformulations offer bridges between disciplines. So within the robotics AI community, some people think that this view is a nice view in the sense that in principle, although not in practice yet, but in principle, the framework would allow to understand one whole holistic behaving and planning intelligent system as just a system that that does inference on all respects, over actions, over perceptions, over all these things. So in robotics in particular, people sometimes are worried that there is so many different things, so many different concepts being sort of meshed together, and they don't really fit. And in principle, one could say, yeah, but all of these concepts could be viewed as or reformulated as probabilistic inference. Would give a nicer view on robotics, but in practice, actually, this I think has not had much influence yet. And then the reformulations, I think, build bridges between disciplines, so connecting neuroscience and psychology, machine learning, control theory. And just.
So, Mark, but this is a statement of hope, or are you going to tell us that how this is already happening? Like both this idea of a single integrated framework and this multidisciplinary linking.
Yes. So as I said, with the single coherent framework, I think it's more a statement of hope. Mm-hmm. So people have for each of these elements or subsystems shown that you can reformulate them as inference, and it leads to efficient algorithms. But it's not that anybody, even not even myself, sort of has built this robot who has a brain that does nothing but probabilistic inference and still does all the grasping, manipulation, and so forth. Mm-hmm. In practice, I don't know. It's really hard to do this. Although in principle, I want to say it should just be a matter of effort, right? It should just be a matter of try hard.
Well, it's something like this, like a small matter of programming, and then for some reason it never happened. So.
Yes. So in this case, I think it's more a matter of hope. In this case, no, I think people have been connecting, definitely. And I'll talk about this a bit more in a second. Right? But I think the bridges are obvious. Okay, well, this is one, right? These articles are not the newest ones, but I think the slide gets the point across. So I'm not a neuroscientist, right? So you're maybe much more neuroscientist than I am. But this is just what I perceive from outside, that there has been a trend, and maybe still is a trend, to sort of think as neurocomputation as that it might be possible to abstract it functionally as doing probabilistic inference. And here's some, famous book, Bayesian Brain, and then a lot of influential papers who sort of claim that, well, maybe it is sort of convenient to sort of abstract away the details of ion channels and I don't know what, and sort of think of neural systems as functionally doing nothing but probabilistic inference. And of course, people have shown, I think there's, people have shown that yes, you can argue that a population of neurons putting together can do probabilistic inference. And here's just some examples of that. So what's the point of that? Well, the point of that is that if people show that neural systems can perform probabilistic inference, and if other people like me show that using probabilistic inference they can do planning or stochastic optimal control, that naturally leads to an idea how neural systems could do planning or stochastic optimal control. And that's a question to the audience. Do you know of any other concepts where people explain how neural systems could really do optimal control or planning? I mean, really. So, where systems would maybe solve a Riccati equation, right? Do you know of any system where a neural system would solve a Riccati equation, which is a method in optimal control? I'm not aware of it, and I think it is really difficult to think of neural systems, how they actually should do these computations in Bellman backups and recursive value functions and how to represent them and so forth. Whereas using this bridges, well, you could say, well, we have a population of neurons, and they can do inference. If they do inference, I can tell you how they actually can also solve stochastic optimal control problems.
Yeah, but is that the right way to phrase the question? I mean, brains did not evolve to solve your equations, right? Brains evolved to survive in the world, and forage and reproduce and so on, right? So maybe you should define your benchmark in a way that's sort of compatible with this biological system we're looking at.
Yeah, well, you're saying brains have not evolved to solve my equations. That's an interesting statement. Certainly not my equations, because I wasn't alive then.
It's a fact.
But they have evolved to solve some problems, as you say, right? Again, I'm more of a machine learner and robotics, but people in human motion analysis, for instance, they argue that the motions that they actually generate, you can model them as if they would solve optimal control problem. That doesn't mean that the computational mechanism behind that would actually really solve these equations, but the result that we see, the behaviors are as if they would solve optimal control problems.
No, but I'm making a different point, right? I'm saying your challenge to your audience was, well, does anybody know about another solution to this problem, the solution we have? And I'm saying in your question there's a circularity because the criteria that you used was already phrased in terms of the answer you wanted to hear. That's a good
point. So let me put it like that. I think there might be examples, like really behavioral examples, where people solve optimal control problems. That was, again, misformulated. It's difficult, actually, to get it right.
This is my challenge to you, right?
Yeah, where the behavior is equivalent to as if they would solve optimal control problems.
Take psychology, right? Humans are delusional, okay? Humans are, for instance, are completely irrational decision making.
Yeah.
Okay. So to start to look at those phenomena from perspective becomes already a bit more challenging.
Yeah.
Because suddenly you see you have to start to add assumptions to still make such frameworks survive.
Yeah.
All right. So it's not. Yes, of course. If you say, well, my problem is to balance a pole, right? And they say, oh, here you see, it's optimal control. Isn't that amazing? Oh well, but maybe brains did not evolve to balance poles or to only do optimal control.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is so it's a bit more challenging. We're not saying this is a useless framework. No, this is why we listen to you. It's interesting. We have to learn about this. However, we cannot really say, well, everything's solved now.
Ooh.
Okay.
Gosh, I did not want to say that everything's solved now.
Yeah, but look, if you're phrasing your question in terms of like, does anybody know another solution than X? It already starts to sound a bit exclusive, right?
Let me repeat. Does anybody know of a neural system that could generate behavior which is equivalent to the behavior that you would get if you would solve an optimal control problem? And now, I agree that not all behaviors that we see in the world are such types of behaviors, because there's non-rational behavior, all of this. But I think there is also behaviors which actually are as if they would solve optimal control problems, as we know from behavioral studies, right? So, of course, no, it's not explaining everything. It's that part. It's those parts where we see that people, do solve problems as if they would solve planning or control problems. It's only that part. Anyway, I wish I would have other slides, like also on the classical, like behavioral things.
Now look, I'm aware of these things and so many others.
Yeah, like
typical motor control,
Köhler
kind of
against
stuff,
others.
and so on. And sure, no problem. Okay.
Right.
A good example might be this Walcott stuff with the action planning for arm movement, right? There have been all sorts of papers comparing this to optimal control strategies.
Right. That's what I was.
Interesting to look at, perhaps, for this comparison.
But it's actually not only that, it's also the really classical psychology, like experiments with, say, rats or so. And again, it's not my expertise. I'm sorry, I'm a layman almost, but you all know these classical experiments about rats in a maze, where it's this arguments between behavioral approaches and so forth, planning approaches, where rats actually go through a maze and so forth. But then if you block a path, they actually behave as if that would be a rational agent that really understands that this path is blocked and sort of take the next shortest path, having a map of that maze. You know these experiments, right? So rats are able of these types of cognitive processes, and now the question is, what neural system could do that? Mm-hmm. It's just that behavior, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. And there is really actually interesting experiments by, what's his name? I shouldn't talk about...
Maybe Radish, you mean?
Yeah, Radish, exactly, where he shows that there is these propagating waves in the hippocampus over the place cell representations of that maze, and sort of arguing that what the rat is actually doing is sort of having these waves of activation that represent possible paths through the maze temporally, which is totally interesting, and sort of these waves and whatever are most coherent to actually its own map, sort of tell it where the rat could go. It's these types of computation.
The next speaker might be sort of alluding to these kinds of issues, maybe not directly, but to some extent.
Okay, it's these kind of computational abilities, or functional abilities, I should say, that I'm talking about. So this is a very functional view of the whole thing. It's not really telling that the lowest level computation would really be like we do Bayesian inference. But on a functional level, it might suggest that you could abstract the function as doing probabilistic inference. These papers that I was talking about. And there is the question that we just discussed. Okay. Now, what is that idea of planning as inference? It's the general concept is really simple, and I usually explain it with that little graphical model here. So assume that you have an agent, and this agent has in his head or whatever some kind of representation of its own future. And this representation of its own future I'm drawing here as a graphical model, but these could be any kinds of representations of things that are now or that are in the future somehow within that agent. Now there is representations which concern aspects about the now. So these are things about the current state that the agent might know, and I indicated this with a grade shading. So these are random variables which we know, which we condition basically. There might be other random variables which concern the now, like the actions that the agent is doing right now. And there might be random variables which concern things that are in the future, and further, random variables which concern things in the future. To give an illustrative example, so this might be a graphical model which represents that currently I'm sitting on a couch. So this here is a random variable indicating I'm sitting on a couch, and this is some action, whatever. And this is another random variable, something in the future. So a representation of a thing that in the future, which indicates that I have a beer in the hand. And so now imagine that in this agent it happens that, well, he knows that currently he sits on the couch, but all the random variables that are in the future, he does not observe, of course, because they're in the future. Doesn't really make sense of them as thinking of them as being observed. But however, that agent decides, and there is a real hole actually in the whole thinking. How does the agent decide that? But the agent decides to sort of think of that random variable which is in the future, which indicates himself having a beer in hand as being observed. So he imagined himself observing himself that he has a beer in hand in the future. So he considers that future event as being an observed event. It's like a wishful observation actually in the future. And conditioned on that wishful observation in the future, he sort of computes posteriors over all the other things, including the actions right now. And if you think about what that means, is that he's constructing a future of himself, conditioned of things that he wants to see in the future and things that he actually sees in the now, and computes posteriors over all missing pieces, intermediate random variables, that are coherent with that. So he's actually constructing a coherent future of himself, coherent to the things that he wants to see. So we have a graphical model, and we condition it on goals and decide observations in the future and infer the actions and all the missing pieces that are in between.
So, sorry.
Yeah.
Why is the Y necessary, and what does it represent? Because that's not labeled.
I don't know. This is just a toy graphical model. It could be anything. It could be, for instance, me standing up. Or it could be actually many things. Me standing up, walking to the kitchen, opening the fridge, and going in there, right? It's like, this is a very crude abstraction. It's all the states, the things that are in between right now, me sitting on the couch and later having a beer in hand. So this is totally crude. It's just saying there could be, things in between, and he's doing inferences over all of that. And yes, so why you were asking why is it not observed? Well, the thing is, he only imagines himself having a beer in the hand, but the other things he infers. The clever question here actually is really, so why does he have this idea to want himself to observe to have a beer in the hand? That's an interesting question, but I'll leave that out. So why is that an interesting concept? Well, it's interesting because I think it gives a bit an alternative perspective on how these types of planning work than the Bellman view would usually give. So first, this concept naturally generalizes to arbitrary graphical models, to networks of things that have to be taken care of, to networks of information that we have about the now, networks of constraints that we have to fulfill in the future, and goals. There might be different goals and different wishful observations that we have in the future. And in a sense, you could imagine that an agent has such a network of things in his head, and there's a permanent, I call it a relaxation process, because you all know that inference is actually related to, say, free energy minimization or, relaxation in Ising-Spingen models. So you could actually think of it as there's some permanent relaxation and process that tries to generate coherence between these random variables. And as soon as the agent happens to imagine a goal, that thing just relaxes to computing other posteriors, and these posteriors lead it to choose actions that lead it there. Another example is that you might walk through the street, and initially you're like Buddhist, you have no goals and anything in your thing, but then suddenly you see an advertisement of an ice cream. And that's again that funny question: how does it happen? But then you see this advertisement of the ice cream, and suddenly, well, you see yourself actually eating the ice cream. That's the wishful observation in the future. And then your brain just does that relaxation and computes posteriors over actions, and you cannot do different than just walk to the next thing and buy the ice cream. That's a bit the idea of this type of permanent inference process, and that might be going on in this in this perspective. So it means.
Buddhists do have goals, by the way. Just a little footnote there.
Yeah, thanks. I thought I didn't have a better word. Okay. So what is appealing about the thing, more technically, it works for networks of things and goals, constraints, observations. Interestingly, it does not distinguish in any sense between sensor-motor representations of perception and action. I mean, we all know there are so many examples where perception, like the computational principles behind perception, can be written down as inference processes. And like there is latent variable models of sensory representations or whatever. And in a sense, that model would do the things both at the same time, and it does not really distinguish whether these random variables are action random variables or perceptual random variables or sensory random variables. It's just one process going on all the time.
But Marc, now, what's the price you pay doing this?
I'll go about this later, yes. Okay. Because then later I will really explain how to actually do things. And then we got rid of the notion of the state as being one big random variable, so we do not have to compute value functions anymore over like one big state space. That's perhaps one of the most, one of the core reasons why we could also derive technical algorithms which outperform Bellman approaches. A couple of points about the history. So I'm certainly not the first to have this idea. And what I think what should emphasize most, really, is that people like Cooper and Schechter, they had very similar and really nice results actually already on this perspective. Reformulating optimal decision making in Markov decision processes as inference processes. Not exactly as we do it now, so there was no, sometimes, well, anyway, there's slight differences. For instance, there's non-discounted, there were non-discounted, and they only investigated finite time, slight differences. But this, I think this was sort of forgotten, which is really a pity. And then instead of continuing that, people started doing just dynamic programming, Markov decision processes. But then people, again, started having these conceptual ideas, and all of these are publications who had the same conceptual ideas as I just mentioned. But none of them really rigorously proved or derived arguments that were provably generating optimum policies in MDPs or something like that. And then we started having a first formulation in terms of expectation maximization, and there were a couple of following up papers. I should also mention this very much, Matthew Botwinick, which people maybe know is from a completely different era. And he has a paper at NIPS, which turns out to be like really equivalent and also formulating it as an EM loop in a sense, as we do. And then later on, there was a lot of work on stochastic optimal control, which I'm going to talk about more later.
Yeah, Botwinick was a speaker in this school 2 years ago, I think.
Mm-hmm. Great. So here's just a slide to summarize all the things that I will not talk much about. But the slide is also helpful to give you an idea of why we're able to derive algorithms on the technical side that could outperform other kind of more Bellman standard algorithms. And as you see in all of these cases, I was drawing down the graphical model. And not surprisingly, well, the crucial thing is now that now, if we can write down graphical models which are sort of structured in some way, we can exploit that structure with the type of inference approximations that we do. Well, this was just the initial formulation as a mixture of MDPs. So I skipped that. That one here was showing that you could do inference or planning in multi-agent systems efficiently if the structure of the multi-agent system sort of factors in that way. And that it was worked together with Shlomo Silberstein and Kumar. This was showing that we could derive efficient algorithms if we have sort of distributed representations to encode hierarchies. So this is actually about hierarchical controllers, and we could optimize these hierarchical controllers in a POMDP setting quite efficiently. There was some work on model-free reinforcement learning with Nikos Vlasis, and a lot of work which is highly robotics relevant on relational methods. Again, here you have to use very crude approximations to get this going. And this is what I will focus on later in the talk. So this is the last slide in the introductory thing. So concerning the line of work that I just mentioned, the first approach that we actually proposed was to formulate a problem of planning, and this is the formal definition of what it would mean to compute optimal policies in the Markov decision process. And we sort of reformulated this as a process of expectation maximization, which is the same as free energy minimization, in a mixture of MDPs, and we just got that theory. And if you would want to look up this paper or this kind of work, you could see that paper, and most of the things that you've seen on the previous slide actually follow that formulation. But I decided that in this talk I will not go into any details of that formulation, and instead consider a bit more a newer formulation, which is more within the stochastic optimal control problem, and which I think even leads to more interesting results concerning model-free reinforcement learning. Okay, so this was the first part, general motivation of the concept, and the rough ideas. Now the second part will show that we can really formulate the stochastic optimal control problems as a type of probabilistic inference, and more specifically it will be Kabel-Gleibler minimization. So it's a bit technical. There's equations in there, but I try to wake you up at one point later on, where I start talking about Boltzmann representation of policies, and I also try to explain these equations like also on a conceptual level, just to, I don't know, even if you cannot follow in that time all the equations, you can follow the ideas of that. So. Again, this work is we shouldn't be the only one definitely to get credit for this type of work, because there were a lot of people recently who looked into stochastic optimal control, which is almost the same as planning in Markov decision processes, and had the idea that you could reformulate this as Kabel-Gleibler minimization or using path integrals, or I don't know. There's lots of other methods like the natural actor critic and things like that. We looked into those and were fascinated actually by all of this research, and but also had the impression that in some of these formulations there were a bit twists which we didn't like. And at the end of this part, I will explicitly go into going back to Kaplan and explaining why we think there was a twist which we didn't like so much. So we thought for a while, I don't know, to get the formulation cleaner, and I think together with a really good PhD student in Edinburgh and Situ J. Kumar in Edinburgh, we got a formulation which is not so different to the previous ones, which we think is cleaner. And in the end, really, I think was a nice umbrella framework for the existing albums. And in this framework, we do not have to make any assumptions about noise of the dynamics or the dynamics itself. And we can prove that from this framework, we can derive iterative solutions which are globally convergent. I definitely have to talk later about, I mean, it doesn't say that it's computationally feasible to do this, but the algorithm in principle is globally convergent. I'll go to this later. And also, which is maybe more interesting, to have this model-free version. And here is one paper, but we are also currently preparing a nicer journal version of that. So, to finally get formal, we look into a problem which is called stochastic optimal control. So what is that? Stochastic optimal control assumes that there is a process, stochastic process, where we have one random variable representing the state, and this is the state at time 0, and this is the state at time 1, and the state at time 1 depends stochastically on the state at time 0, and it also depends on the controls that we applied in the previous time step, and the controls we denote by u. And this iterates. So in the next time step, we again choose another control signal, and depending on the control signal and the previous state, we enter a new state x2. So this process is described by this transition and this transition dynamics. So the probability of the next state given the previous state and the controls. And very often this is assumed to be Gaussian in some nonlinear dynamics. But actually in all of the things that we derive, we never really need that assumption. We just work directly with any transition probabilities. Now, that was a description of the process, of the control. That's the controlled process. And now what's actually classically the goal? Classically, the goal in optimal control is to, is defined via first defining a cost. So assume that we roll out from this process, we roll out trajectories. And here the notation is that x is a whole trajectory, just a vector of the states in all the time slices. And here the underlined u is the same thing. It's just a trajectory. Oh, here by the way, it's the same. I should have used the same notation there. So to every rolled out process, we associate a cost, and that cost we just assume, as is typically done in optimal control, to be a sum of cost terms that arise in every time slice. Maybe to make this more intuitive, these cost terms could, in simple cases, the cost would, for almost all time slices, only depend on the control. So the cost would, for instance, penalize forces that I apply, or the energy consumption of muscles, or whatever. So the cost would only penalize control signals, in a sense, and not depend on the state, except for the very last time step where the cost might depend only on state, and say that you get a really high cost if you do not reach with the end effector some state. That would be a typical example. The problem now is, please find a deterministic feedback controller, which maps at every time step the state to a new control, that minimizes the expected cost. So taking the expectation over that whole stochastic process, the graphical model that I've seen here. And the classical approach is dynamic programming, so you can define a value function or the optimal cost to go function, which is defined like this. So it just is the minimal cost that necessarily arises in the future if you're optimal. So there's no way that you could arrive a better cost than that if you start off in some state. And then it turns out that this function fulfills a iterative recursive equation, and that recursive equation is called the Bellman equation. And solving the Bellman equation is the classical approach to solve these problems. Now, here's the reformulation, or the starting point of the reformulation. So here we have again that process. So we have a state, a control, and we enter a new state. We have a control, enter a new state. We augment that process by another random variable, which we call just z. And the z is a binary random variable. And you could think of that as being the happiness variable, right? So for instance, if the final time slice here represents the final state of myself, that random variable would be 1 if and only if I have a beer in the hand. It's binary, so it's sufficient to just assume that it's binary. So this binary random variables that we associate in every time slice to sort of represent, they represent whether the state and the controls do something that we want. It's a bit like these wishful observations that we have. So this is just an auxiliary variable that we introduce, and we define that variable to be in state 1, so to be happy actually in that time slice, with a probability which is between 0 and 1, and which is proportional to the exponential of the negative cost. So meaning that if the cost is very high, negative cost, and then the exponential of that very negative number will be very low. So the probability that we're happy is very small. Whereas if the cost is very small, that exponential might go. So this might go to 0, and the probability of we being happy goes to 1. Now the interesting thing is that what I've drawn in the graphical model already here is we condition that graphical model to always see 1. So this is the analog to what I said before. We condition our own model of the future to things that we want to see. So the wishful observations here are that we are always happy in every time slice. So that this binary random variable is equal to 1 in every time slice. Just from these definitions, what you can see is that so the log likelihood of always observing 1 in that process is exactly equal to the cost. That's just how we constructed it of the process. But one should also note that so conditional to a specific trajectory. But in general, the log likelihood of just observing 1, where we have marginalized over trajectories or taken the expectation over trajectories, is not equal to the expectation because the expectation in the log does not commute. So we cannot just do a log likelihood maximization, I think. That's not where we go. But what we can do is this, and this is maybe the core slide of the second part, where I have to do some effort to sort of explain what's actually happening. So we can formally look at two different processes, and again think of that agent, and the agent sort of imagines two different futures, right? So these are two different futures. The one is the process, or the future, if you want to call it like that, which we call EQPI, which we call the control process. So this is, if you look in a precise definition, this is the process that you get when you roll out the process, the normally dynamics of the system, and you choose a certain action policy, and just that. So this is the probability distribution over the future that you get when you follow a certain policy. This is what I call the control process. In a sense, you could think about this as the future that the agent can generate if it chooses a certain policy pi. Now let's define this other thing. It's called the posterior process, and we don't note it like this. And for the time, well, let me go down here in the definition of that. So what is this? That process is again a rollout of the whole stochastic process. It uses the transition dynamics here, it uses some policy, but for now, please think of that as being uniform, as being uninformed. It's not really controlling. So think of the pi 0 as just being uniform or 1, and this drops out. So this is just like a completely uncontrolled rollout of the process, normalized, but conditioned on always seeing ones. So, but here's this additional term, which is the likelihood term, which you get when you condition all of these random variables to 1. So to make this intuitive again, two descriptions of the future. One is the one that I can generate if I choose a policy. The other one is the one which is uncontrolled, no policy, but is conditioned on always seeing 1. Right? It's two different possible futures. Now the thing is, what you can show is, if you try to choose a policy so that the control process matches the future that is conditioned on always seeing 1, then you get optimality. Let me try to explain this thing here. So, if you choose a policy pi such that the control process, that is the future that you actually, the description of the future that you get if you follow your own policy, matches or well tries to match the future that you would get with a random policy, say, but conditioned on always observing 1. And if you try to minimize this, so this is the so-called Kalbe-Glabler divergence, I'm going to define this later, you will see that minimizing this is equivalent to minimizing the expected costs, which is exactly what we wanted to do for stochastic control, plus some other terms, which I have to get into in detail. But that's the first core result, that this Kalbe-Glabler divergence between these two different futures of the agent actually is very closely related to optimal control. So what is this other term? Well, the z up here is just a constant. You can neglect that. And the other term here is actually it's measuring the similarity between the policies. And if we think of the pi 0 as being a uniform and uncontrolled random policy, then actually this also wants our own policy to be as entropic as possible. So the equivalence here is not really perfectly strict. Actually, it says if we minimize that Kalbe-Glabler divergence, we minimize expected costs. This term you could think of as drop out. But we also try to maximize at the same time the entropy of the policy. So it's a bit like a max entropy attempt to sort of minimize expected costs. But you can quite easily from that derive, well, if you sort of constrain that minimization only over deterministic policies, then this solves exactly the optimal control problem.
But why do you bring in now the entropy as well of this solution space? Why is this irrelevant? It wasn't like something that you got now for free, or is this a new ingredient that you really had to introduce to solve this problem? It's not that I chose to introduce the entropy, and I'm not sure if I should say I got it for free. But the thing is just that we realized that the Kalbe-Glabler divergence between these two futures is the same what classical optimal control people minimize, plus some additional entropy term. Okay, I understand now.
So it just pinpoints what the difference would be. So if you would do this directly, this inference, then you would do optimal control, but at the same time get a policy which is still as entropic as possible. But if you constrain a policy to be not entropic, for instance, to be deterministic, well, you get exactly the equivalence. Right. So this is just seems a rather technical observation, but we'll derive a couple of things now from that. I think it's turned out to be a really good starting point for some more theory.
So,
yeah?
Just a wild speculation, has this anything to do with you choosing a maximum entropy distribution for your z variable, that this comes out like this? Or
max entropy distribution for the z variable?
That I cannot form that you assume there is a maximum entropy distribution. I was just wondering if that maybe is behind this sort of maximum.
Certainly you're true that it is all of this happens to be as it is because we chose that the z variable to define like this in the exponential space. And certainly everything, it's related. If you would not have chosen to the z variable, which is a binary variable, to be in that space, or to be defined like that, we would not have ended up with the entropy term, right? Sorry.
Yeah.
If it's related to a max entropy distribution over z, I'd be confused, because the z actually is like an auxiliary, a helper variable. We could even throw it away, because we always condition it to be 1. But it is related to max entropy over the process. So we try to find a process that is the future which is as similar as possible to the conditioned future, so the future which includes our wishful observations, but at the same time be as entropic as possible.
But now if this comes out of the choice of having an exponential on your cost function,
yeah,
how many options did you really have to do this reasonably, right? Because you do want to bound in some way your cost function. So that's
when you say how many options do I have,
yeah,
to define the z differently?
Exactly.
The whole theory would not work if you would define it just differently. So in a sense, I mean, we all know that there is this translation between energies and probabilities always in the same, way. So an x negative energy is probability, or net log likelihood is an energy. There's always these translations, right? And this is what this is, just exactly a transform like that. So we translate energy, so costs, with the x negative energy, and this is a Boltzmann temperature, if you want to put it like that, into some probability. And
right.
It wouldn't work if you would use that transformation. And don't ask me if there would be other options. We had no idea. Okay. Now I go over some slides which actually give the proofs of that, and not to go through these equations, but to just show you how many lines of proofs it requires. And the answer, not many at all. I mean, obviously, the challenge in here was to get the formulation right, but then once you get the formulation right, you just write down these divergences, and by definition of what the divergence is, you just plug in the things, and then you get the result that we just had. There's some additional observations that we can make with that. So making tighter relations to how it's related to the energy minimization, or also EM steps. So the kind of divergence that we actually minimize here is related to a free energy. And well, you can get closer relations of what actually that minimization of the divergence that we talk about, how it would be related to a more EM kind of representations. But I don't go into these details. Right. So in the second part, I want to move on with a few more concrete results, which are about now deriving from that theory, deriving methods that provably converge to optimal policies. So the minimization of the divergence, the minimization of the divergence over the full space of policies gives us an interesting policy, but it's too entropic, as I said, right? It also tries to maximize entropy. It does not really minimize expected costs. What you can do to sort of get rid of that entropy is to iterate this. That was an intuitive formulation of it. But to put it differently, you can let me actually first explain this equation. I think it's more intuitive. You could try to iteratively iterate that minimization. What does that mean? You start off with some completely random policy, and that random policy generates a future. You condition that future on the observations you want to see. That is, then you get this posterior process right here. Then you try to find a policy which would match this future. And this policy, as we said, minimizes expected costs, but also maximizes entropy. And you get this new policy here. You minimize this, you get the new policy here. Then you take that policy, and again, use that policy as the new prior, in a sense, to define a process of the future, and then use that new process of the future and condition it again on the observations that you want to see, and then again compute a new policy that matches that distribution, right? So you always take the posterior policy that you computed in the previous observation as the prior in the next iteration, and if you have a bit of intuition about that, I guess you could sort of understand that this will always reduce the entropy, and the problem that we had, that the policy sort of always also maximize entropy, sort of goes away. You can make this a bit more rigorous. You can show that in each of these iterations, actually, the expected cost is will provably decrease. So this generates a series of policies where the expected costs really decrease. This is not yet a convergence proof. The proof is very simple. I just mentioned this. So it just monotonically decreases, not yet a convergence proof, but it turns out with quite a bit more effort, actually, quite a bit more math, that it can show that this update really converges to the minimum, to the exact minimum. It converges to the minimization of expected cost if you just iterate long enough. And the proof uses a very specific representation of the policy. And that representation of the policy will be interesting for all of the rest of this talk. But this now makes things more and more concrete, actually. So assume that the agent uses a very specific representation of that policy. So it represents policies, the policy as for every state, as a distribution over the controls, and represents it as a Boltzmann distribution. What does that mean? It means that assume that you have a Boltzmann machine, and the Boltzmann machine has an energy term, and in this Boltzmann machine there is variables which represent controls, and there is variables which represent states. And you have some connectivity between these states, if you want to put it like that. But anyway, you have an energy over these variables that represent state and variables that represent controls. The energy that we call psi. And that Boltzmann machine defines the joint distribution over x and u. If we want to have the conditional distribution over controls given x, then we have to normalize, and that normalization is just the partition given by that partition function back there. So the psi back there is just, if you would pull it out of the x, it would just be the normalization, you know it, right? But if you put it back into the x, it's what physicists, for some reason, call partition function. And the definition of that partition function is there, and it's, I mean, as you see, it's ignore the log for a while. The integral over u, and then this part, this is exactly how you would usually define a normalization constant, and then because you want to pull it back into the exp there, you also take the log. So it's the log of the integral of the exp of that energy. Okay, so now we have like a Boltzmann machine representation of that policy, and it turns out that on that representation, these iterative processes that we talked about become surprising. I think you cannot see it here yet, but they become surprisingly intuitive. Well, we'll simplify more and more after a while. But the first point is that using that specific representation of the policy, and if you think about it, it's not making any assumptions really about the policy space, because it can represent any distribution as a Boltzmann machine. Using that representation, we can prove the convergence of these iterates, and we can also explicitly write down, that's the main point, we can explicitly write down which policy minimizes that divergence, which so far was completely abstract. We just said it minimizes, but how? Well, you can prove that it can minimize it using this equation here. Okay. So using that parameterization of the policy, we could show convergence of that iteration, both in the which case is that? This is the finite horizon case, and we could prove the same also for the infinite horizon case, where in the infinite horizon case, what we want to minimize is the sum of the costs which are discounted, and there is this discount factor gamma, and well, anyway, so we have the equations for both of these cases, the infinite discounted case and also the finite horizon case. Let me conclude, so now the second part, so this technical part. What have we gained now? Well, the first thing is we just reformulated optimal control problems as minimizing coupled lambda divergence. We got some insightful relations between these things. And in particular, we could show that if we just minimize over the deterministic policies, we exactly solve the problem. And we also show that if we sort of iterate, always taking the posterior as being the new prior, we actually do converge. I have this here, we do converge to the optimal policy. And these iterations over that equation here, we could make very explicit by using a Boltzmann machine type representation of the policy. And we get these exact equations here. So all of that is, I don't know, I think it's very interesting. It's also interesting in the sense that it generalizes a lot of previous work, and it will also lead to like a new type of model-free method that we will see later. Without going too much into detail, but I still wanted to mention that these ideas and the whole type of thinking and so forth was already, of course, present in Kappan's work. And there was a really nice paper, and this is usually what we take as a reference, which is optimal control as a graphical model inference problem. Right? So all the principal ideas, they were already there in a sense. This is exactly the type of formulation that they used. A core difference is that in all of their formalism, the control variables do not appear. So they define costs only over state, and they minimize divergences between distributions over state only. And they assume, so they get posteriors over state trajectories, and they always assume that, well, if you have a posterior over state trajectories, then of course there's no question that we can also have a policy which generates that distribution. And this is always a point in the paper where I was sort of stuck, because how can you assume that, well, you computed a posterior over the state trajectories, it's fine, and then you assumed, okay, but then there must also be a policy which generates that distribution, which is not really so clear in the general case, right? And that's why, well, it's actually true that in the general case it's not possible, because the process might have very strange dynamics, the policy space might be constrained, might have a very strange noise. And it turns out that this is possible only under a certain assumption, a very technical thing. And this is exactly the assumption which I also always stumbled over in that paper, which I didn't understand. But you can now understand it, that we can show that all of this is possible exactly if, or is, all of this you can derive from our more general formulation exactly if that condition is true. And there is more papers that we can sort of relate or show that there are special cases, in particular also this dynamic programming, policy programming, using function approximations and many other things. Okay. One of the outcomes of all of that, which I find interesting and which I thought I wanted to sort of emphasize here in this presentation, is that it can derive a model-free reinforcement learning algorithm. So, so far we talked a lot very technically about stochastic optimal control. And if you think about it, it's a bit, I mean, it's very special. So you assume you have a perfect model of the world. And using that perfect model of the world, you iterate these arguments, and then you get an optimal policy, minimizing expected costs, and you have a perfect model of the costs as well. So reinforcement learning addresses the problem where all of these things are not really known. So in stochastic optimal control or planning a Markov decision process, we assume to know the costs and transition probabilities. In reinforcement learning, well, you have an agent which just wanders around in the world, and while wandering around in the world, he collects data. I have a slightly different notation here, talk about states being S and action and controls, so actions being A instead of X and U. So sorry about that. So the agent just wanders around in the world and collects data, and from that data he needs, or she, it, needs to organize behavior. So behavior that leads to, for instance, maximizing reward. I usually use that little picture here to sort of categorize the different approaches in that case. So there's people like myself, actually, who are in favor of model-based reinforcement learning. So what that does is it takes that experience, and from that experience learns models of the environment, so learns a transition model of the environment, learns a reward model. And given that model, it uses planning methods, be it planning as inference or planning as dynamic programming and development approach, and then generates policy from that. Another route is what is called model-free reinforcement learning, so which takes the experience and does not try to learn a world model of, and instead tries to typically learn what is called value functions. And these might be value functions over the state space or the Q function over state and action space. And these functions are being learned using Q learning or 2D learning, classical things that you can read in Barter and Sutton's book. And then from that value, you just do action selection using a mux or mux or maybe a noisy mux or whatever, and then derive the policy.
But isn't already a bit of a misnomer to go with model free, because the states are still defined. I mean, you just don't know exactly how they relate to your actions. So in some sense, the ingredients of what could make a model you do predefine, right?
So it's not me inventing these.
I know.
It's a good point. So the whole picture relates to the case where we assume full observability of the states.
Exactly.
So in those cases, there is no difference between states and perceptual input. So I think what you would refer to is actually, really model-free would just map from perceptual inputs to responses. And then if you cannot assume that the perceptual inputs encode state, then it's really a big question, a modeling question, what you assume is the true underlying state, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I'm not talking, I don't know, I don't talk about POMDPs, and this picture is also not about POMDPs
Right.
in that sense. But you're right, I would totally agree in that case. But in a fully observable case, people typically don't distinguish between state and perceptual input, and then that's what they think that you would, learn a value function over that state. Just for completeness, I also noted other routes to go. You can go from experience directly to policy search. So this is sometimes done using black box optimization of policies. So using evolutionary algorithms or stochastic search or also global optimization to really just optimize parameters, thinking of the whole world as a black box. Or also using gradient methods, actually policy gradients are really important. And then I also noted this arc here, which is dynamic programming, computing from a model to value. Okay, so in the second part, I talked about stochastic optimal control, how you can reformulate it as a problem of Korbel-Gleibler minimization and derive the iterates. But all of this was assuming that we know the world and the costs. Now, how can we do the same thing not knowing the worlds and the costs? And there again, it's not very innovative what we came up with, because it's the same trick that they always do. Also in the book of Barter Sutton, or when you derive TD or Q learning, it's always the same principle that happens. So when you derive some kind of update equation or some policy update equation, assuming that you know the model, and in our case, this is this equation here. The typical way to sort of transform this into a model-free version is to, instead of integrating over the true world, so integrating over all possible transitions in the true world, and assuming that you know the transition probabilities, and inserting here your costs or rewards, assuming that you know the rewards. So instead of doing that, you sort of replace these terms, these exact integrations and the exact reward function by samples that the agent gets from the true world. So going from that equation to that down here, we sort of replace that cost function, so the analytic one, which we don't know anymore, by an empirical sample of that cost function, which is the reward, and I just defined reward as being negative cost. And we replace this integral over the world model, which we don't know anymore, by an empirical representative, namely, and now I have to look very precisely, by that one here. Right, that one I'll explain in a second. So we replace the precise cost function by an empirical sample of the cost, and the precise transition, integrating over all possible transitions by just a sample. So, which means that whenever the agent observes in real time, now one transition, it started off in a state X, did a control U, got a return, a return or reward RT, and it ended up in a new state Y. I should have called this xt plus 1 maybe, but for notation's sake, I call it Y. So this is the new state. Then it updates it updates the psi function in those terms. So these two here are very crude empirical estimates of the true integrals up here. So if I would do this with a learning rate of 1, actually this update here would be very crude and would not really match well this here. But if I just integrate and just average out over many such transitions, if I have enough such transitions, then these crude empirical estimates sort of average out to become equivalent of that. Actually, we can show that this is just a stochastic approximation of these here. And in order to average out, you have a learning rate alpha here, which is smaller than 1. And basically, what you do is, instead of doing this exact update as it is done here, you sort of say that the new function is equal to the old one, and then all of the change of the function, which is all the terms back here, you just multiply it by a term smaller than alpha. So the new estimate of the psi function is the old estimate of the psi function, and then you have a learning factor smaller than 1, and this is then the update term. And this is where it starts looking all totally similar to reinforcement learning, which is I remember the PhD student in that situation. So imagine that we were doing all of this theory, actually almost over a year or so, and developing all the exact stuff and the planning algorithms, stochastic optimal control. Then we came up to thinking about reinforcement learning, model-free reinforcement learning. Then we came up with that and having these equations. And then the student thought, and now we are back to Q-learning? So we did all this math then only to end up with Q-learning? Or, I mean, so he was really, at first he was quite shocked in a sense that it all boils down to something that it seemingly that people would have known forever. So we try to understand a bit more in detail. I mean, it didn't take long, but try to understand a bit more detail. Now, is it actually, it looks so similar to Q-learning and value function iteration or TD learning. Yeah, but it turns out it's actually not. So there is slight differences, really interesting differences. So let me explain these equations in relation to TD learning. And maybe I explain TD learning first. So because it seems that not everybody knows TD learning.
So this reminds me actually more of SARSA rather than Q learning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because there's no max operation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. Let me go. It'll take a while through that slide, and then let's ask the question again. Exactly, there's no max. So let's first talk about this equation here, which is temporal difference. And so in temporal difference learning, the agent tries to associate a value to every state, which is the value function, right? And what it does is, when it has an experience, it always says, well, the value of the state is the same as before, plus some update. What is that update? This update is called the temporal difference. And what is it? It sort of says, well, previously I expected a certain value in that state, which is V. But actually what I received empirically is I received a reward R, and then plus the things that I can expect in the new state. So the more accurate or the updated value or the empirical value of that state is R plus, so the immediate reward plus what I can expect in the new state. Whereas previously I expected V of X. And the difference between these two terms is your update. So for instance, if the reward is really high, then what you empirically received is higher than what you expected before. And this is what is called reinforcement. And then you sort of increase the value, whereas if the reward is really low, then the sum of these two terms your empirical estimate is lower than what you expected before, and this decreases the value and so forth. So this term in the bracket is sort of a temporal difference. Okay, and we have a similar term here as well. Okay, I don't go into Q-learning for now. I need to go on to the other things. So this term here in the brackets looks very similar at first sight, which makes one confuse these two things and think they're the same. But let's make some really simple arguments about that equation here. So the first statement, the policy is a Boltzmann distribution. We know that, we assume that, right? Okay. Second, we also proved that this equation converges to an optimal policy. And in most MDPs, if there is no redundancies or equivalent things or so, the optimal policy is deterministic. We proved this. So this equation converges to an Boltzmann energy that describes deterministic policies. So which Boltzmann energy describes deterministic policies? Well, the Boltzmann energy must assign 0 probability to non-optimal actions. So the Boltzmann energy must actually converge to minus infinity, right? So we proved that this equation here converges to Boltzmann energies for actions. That for non-optimal actions converges to minus infinity. Okay. That's the first interesting thing. So relating to the Q function is also a function over state and action, but it assigns values to state and actions, whereas this Boltzmann energy over states and action assigns minus infinity to non-optimal actions. It's a very different thing. So I wish I could draw something, but if you imagine that energy function over the actions in the state, it really goes to minus infinity for the non-optimal states and has a really high peak in a sense, some finite value. It doesn't actually matter which value for the optimal action, and then again minus infinity for all non-optimal actions. So if that energy function converges to minus infinity for the non-optimal actions, then it also simplifies understanding more precisely what these things actually are, and it simplifies a lot understanding what these partition functions actually become. If the energy function goes to minus infinity for non-optimal actions, this normalization with respect to actions, which was here the log of the integral of dx. So the integral did the normalization, and this is just the definition of the partition function. So log integral of x actually becomes an argmax. If you think about that, so if you have an energy function in minus infinity, which describes the Boltzmann distribution, and you want to compute the partition function, log integral x, this operation becomes an argmax. So in a sense, the partition function here is equal to the argmax of the energy, which is exactly the energy of the optimal action. You can also show that at convergence, so if at convergence means when basically when the brackets are 0, so are expected to be 0, at convergence, these brackets and these brackets are the same in a sense. So it's really, simple to see that at convergence, the partition function, the value of that partition function for the optimal control is equal to the classical value, to the Q value, or the Q value of the optimal action, or the optimal value function in that state. Just because otherwise this would not be like a fixed point equation. So, and this is the perspective. So we have an algorithm that takes this Boltzmann energy and it pushes the Boltzmann energy of all non-optimal actions to minus infinity, and the Boltzmann energy of those actions which are optimal to exactly what is the classical value or the Q value, which is just I don't know, surprising. It's closely related to the others, but it's also different. And I think one interesting relation or difference is both the Q value and the value function itself. They have not been introduced as policy parameterizations. So the Q function and the value function were introduced by I don't know who, in standard frameworks, and they were introduced as a means to derive Bellman equations, basically, right? It's like the the framework starts, let us define the value function to be this or that. Let us define the Q function to be this and that. Then we can show it fulfills the Bellman equation. And when the Bellman equation converged, then we can show the optimal policy is the argmax of that Q function or whatever. Whereas here, we didn't really introduce that psi to, I don't know, we just defined that the psi is a parameterization of the policy. It's just a Boltzmann energy, or one possible parameterization of the policy. So the psi actually plays two roles. It directly parameterizes the policy, but it also plays the role, or a similar role than other previously like Q or value functions. But it does this at the same time. So in a sense, in that framework, I think there is no need to distinguish between an actor and a critic. If you allow me to draw that relation, typically people distinguish between the critic, which is sort of a representation of values, and an actor, which is a representation of the policy. Here it's like in one Boltzmann distribution. And well, both planning, if you know the model, or model-free reinforcement learning, they iterate directly on that Boltzmann distribution. And yeah. Okay, so this is how far, I'm going to show some very simple experiments, like more technical ones, but this is so far how we got with developing that. But I actually feel, and then this is also a question to the audience, that it should be interesting also when thinking about really actually neural models of model-free reinforcement learning. I don't know, but I think it would be possible to have like a Boltzmann machine representation doing reinforcement learning with that equation, which would perform quite nice and quite good.
But now the point is, of course, whether if the difference is only what happens to the suboptimal policies, going to minus infinity in one case and some other value in the other, whether that's actually really a significant difference in terms of the implications of that system. And certainly if you want to start to think about this also in neural terms, like minus infinity is still a problem for brains, for instance, right? So there's also a question whether, so if you now find this similarity and the difference,
yes,
right? Is it really a significant difference if it's only on the suboptimal states?
I think I can't answer. Maybe Jochen can answer.
Well, what really strikes me about this is that it almost seems you've done away with the exploration-exploitation dilemma, right? So that's sort of one of the big themes in reinforcement learning, that you need to trade off exploration and exploitation. And I didn't see that in this formulation anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's replaced by this maximum entropy idea, I would argue. So basically, it seems like, right, you're always picking these maximum entropy distributions, which in a way ensure as much exploration as possible, and then you somehow narrow down from there.
That's an interesting observation. Yes, so classical people, try to ensure exploration by, for instance, using Boltzmann distributions, right, to choose actions, like a softmax selection. And yes, so if I, in a sense, I showed that if I iterate until convergence, the entropy thing goes away, right? So if I always take the posterior to become the new prior, I sort of iterate away, I optimize away that max entropy criterion. But if I would not go all the way to convergence, yes, the policy would always include entropy and would implicitly try to maximize entropy as well, which is reflected here in the fact that it's a Boltzmann distribution with not yet to minus infinity converged probabilities to select non-optimal actions. Yes, I wouldn't really say this solves the exploration-exploitation problem, because that would actually lead to Bayesian reinforcement learning or POMDPs, and I wouldn't really say that this does planning in a belief space in that sense. So, yeah. You know that theory about optimal solution of exploitation problems, but it does exactly what people in reinforcement learning use as a heuristic to overcome that. That's true. And I never had that thought. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Sorry, Marc. Well, I had a similar observation in the previous part of your talk when you were talking about this entropy term during planning. So it seems to me that maybe we can formulate it very intuitively, in which you, let's say, you try to figure out, well, you try to simulate the possible future, and then you also know what's the best future. So you try to make this possible future as close as possible to the best future you can have, iteratively. But at the same time, this uncertainty term ensures that you keep your options open. It's a metaphor that is typically used in these entropy maximization schemes. Along the way, you want to keep your options open because you don't know exactly where the best option will be in the future, because you are just iterating.
Yeah.
But along the way, as you proceed in this iteration, while you want to keep your options closed, then your future become more and more close to the best future, and then you also shrink this entropy.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Is that a correct picture? Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You described it nicely. Maybe better than I did before. Yes. And yeah, maybe you're more right than I initially thought with the whole thing.
But you try to decrease the entropy, so you don't try to keep all the options open.
I try to decrease the entropy when I'm trying to be an engineer and minimize expected costs. Right? When I started off to say I wanted to solve the stochastic optimal control problem, but the engineers defined that to minimize expected costs, then I had to show you iterates that actually minimize entropy and put it down. Yes, but maybe I do not always want to just minimize expected costs, giving a model, but instead, in a model, particularly in the model-free case, actually also ensure entropy. And yeah, I don't know, these observations were just really right, that in that case, it might make really sense to sort of limit these iterations to not minimize entropy of the policy. Yeah? Interesting. Right, so I only have a few slides. So just some now more technical things again, like in the papers that we published more at RSS and so forth, how we demonstrated and also did some things. I talked about Boltzmann representations of policies, and that is obvious how that works on finite state action representations. And a big issue in reinforcement learning is all the nice algorithms that are convergent on finite state and action representations. Can you also make them convergent on representations that are like function representations? And well, so the typical way to go from finite state action representations to more continuous states is to assume that over some continuous states or actions we have some basis functions, and to represent the Boltzmann energy now as a linear combination over these basis functions. And again, in the paper, we could then derive these iterates. So now we don't iterate directly on the Boltzmann energy of states and actions, but now we iterate over these weights that parameterize that Boltzmann energy. And the iterates that we had before now just read like that. So this is the, I don't know, the iterations that we can do. In these iterations, we actually need to compute the partition function because we need it right there. And computing the partition function is always tricky unless we have naive basis functions. And it actually works quite nicely if the basis functions are, in that case, they need to be squared, so the squared polynomials in the controls, which is not such a bad limitation, actually. So they only need to be squared limitations in the controls. And then, basically Gaussian in the controls. The policy would be Gaussian in the controls, and then we can also compute partition function efficiently. So here's examples with a standard benchmark, which is this pole on the card, and we compare to the natural actor critic. I should say that, I don't know, these comparisons that I'm going to show, it's like the standard thing that people do in talks, and I do this all, right? But one shouldn't overrate the whole thing. But still, I mean, it's like an exercise that we had to do to sort of compare. But these comparisons are so, I don't know, tricky. Anyway, so we compared on this problem, and actually, this problem is harder than you might expect if the starting point of the pole is really anywhere. So keeping the pole balanced, if the pole is initially already upright, is quite simple. I mean, there's even very simple control laws, even jittering or so, which would keep the pole upright. Whereas if the pole is initially like this, and you have to, I mean, this I think wouldn't work in our case even, or like this, and you have to get it up first by doing these really things, then a normal, like a plain normal, as I did here, reinforcement learner has a hard problem doing that. Model-based methods would not have such a hard problem, they would manage, but a simple model-free learner really has a hard problem to get this going. And this is what we observed actually quite a lot when comparing to ENAC, this natural actor critic. So it turns out that ENAC actually does not converge at all when we initialize like this. There is a lot of details, but I think where's the terminated here, the starting state. So this theta here. So when we just sampled random angles initially in that interval, actually ENAC just did not converge at all to solutions. The sci-learning behaved much better in terms of convergence. So it did converge after, this is the number of episodes that it required to converge. What we then tested is, well, after it converged, we took that policy after the convergence at 400 time step and used that policy as an initialization to ENAC, and then investigated how they further optimize given that. And then, comparing from that initialization, how they improved, and we again, compared, and again, the sci-learning is quite robust in convergence. So that's it's just one simple, small experiment where we showed one thing, and namely that the sci-learning seems to be quite robust, which we liked a lot.
Sorry, there's just a typo probably. At the bottom it says episodes of 500 steps, but then the graph saturates at 200, suggesting that all the episodes end after 200 time steps.
This is the number of episodes.
Yeah, and the y-axis is episode length, and that
wow.
saturates at 200, while at the bottom of the side you talk about 500 step length for the episodes.
Good point, but I think it might not. It might not be a disagreement in the sense that the episodes also terminate earlier if the pole sort of swings down, or if the
so there are some cases where you can't get it up due to the initial conditions.
Yeah, or if the pole just gets out of the interval, some interval, then you just abort the episode. So I think, although it says here that the episodes are of 500 step length, I think of maximally 500 step length. But I think you sort of terminate when it's out there, and then.
So this is
frankly, I don't.
As it gets, because sometimes things are doomed from the beginning.
Yes, exactly.
But now we know Jochen is awake. So we better.
Obviously, he was awake all time. Okay, this was just an experiment. I think we did not do yet enough empirical things. We did not explore yet enough this idea of what we can do with that. There's more to do. I'm mostly focused on theory, and I actually don't have any conclusion, and just a single thanks slide. In particular, for the last case, I wanted to thank very much that PhD student Konrad Rawlik and also his first supervisor, Situ Vijaykumar. We did a lot together and really collaborated in that case. And thanks for your attention.
All right, thank you, Mark. Questions? All right, no one else is awake. Here we go, Cyril.
Could you maybe tell a bit more about what it all means for down-to-earth neuroscientists? So what would be your most critical predictions in terms of...
predictions.
Basically test and verify.
Mark doesn't want to be hassled with the real world. Did you get it?
There's other real worlds than neuroscience.
Policy also here.
Predictions, I would be, it's too hard. I mean, by predictions you mean that I say go in the lab and measure this and I tell you that will be the outcome?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I'm not good enough for that.
No, but you said, for instance, based on the singular Boltzmann distribution, don't expect a clear actor-critic distinction.
That's true. So, let's say this work spans a larger space of potential hypotheses that you might want to use to sort of look into the brain. So if other frameworks suggest that there is one representation that needs to represent the value function, and another one which then actually does the action selection, and that one would suggest, well, but there is potentially also an alternative hypothesis. So it's not necessarily that you might find the one or the other. I cannot tell which you find. I have no idea. Yeah, so it's not really necessary that there might be two different representations, and it could all be done on one representation. And the other thing is, but that's not so close to neuroscience, is one level up. I mean, if people would want to formulate what's it usually called, biologically constrained models or biologically feasible models of actual model-free reinforcement learning, again, this is another option to do, and it's no more than an option. I'm really no more than offering options for modeling.
But Cyril wrote a very beautiful paper where he shows that actor-critic models actually don't make a hell of a lot of sense if you look at the brain.
They have a lot of sense, or not a lot of sense?
Well, I paraphrase.
Marc tried to fit in the actor-critic scheme into the basal ganglia. We argued that this is not such a natural thing to do, and I'd more think of these.
So you might want to take a look at this. Might be inspiration.
Yes.
Okay. Armin.
How about computational load? So how many computers do I need to actually perform this whole example in a real robot?
The pole example, so before you said on the real robot, I wanted to say, just one MATLAB, and it's really fast. But then you said on the real robot.
Well, in the real world, you can take whatever device you want.
Yes.
Marc's real world is getting smaller and smaller, you see, because other robots are out as well.
yes. It's funny, so to think about doing this on a real robot, I guess the way we would do it, and everybody else does it, right, is to sort of code for the robot all the things that roboticists code, like do the inverse kinematics, have an arm, do the inverse kinematics for the arm, and have a software infrastructure, ROS is so controlling the robot, all of this, right? And then what is being left is then one interface for that algorithm, and this interface gets the states X and it controls you, states X and controls you. Well, behind that interface, it's the same thing as with a simulator, I would say. So if you would say behind that interface, you just need half a core, I mean, actually, if you would have to do this in real time, you have a lot of time. So it would be computationally very, very cheap, just with MATLAB. But if your answer also included all the infrastructure of doing robotics, well, you need, I don't know, 5 computers running ROS on it.
It will perform real time.
Oh, yes.
Just the algorithm.
Oh, absolutely, because, I mean, the iterates are much faster than the real-time loop could possibly do that. These iterates, they don't take any time at all, actually.
But it will take some time.
Yeah, but not more than inverse kinematics.
Sure. Hector.
It's a very nice formulation. So now, not from a neuroscientist perspective, but from an engineering perspective, the question is whether it works. Okay, so, and one way to test, because these are intractable models, would be, to run many experiments. So you showed experiments with very few variables. So what happens when you add more variables to a problem? Okay, will these methods scale up? Because one of the problems with methods like value iteration and so on is scalability. Okay, so they're great, okay, like you're learning. But if you have many states, okay, there is a problem. Okay, and so what about the scalability? How they trade off quality and you get something at the end, right?
Yes. So I cannot answer so much with respect to the last framework that I've presented. But as I mentioned earlier, maybe I'll flip the slide again, do some advertisement. Really, the motivation for coming up with the concept of planning of inference was exactly that. So what if you have problems which have many variables? In these cases, here that you see these variables are actually discrete, so it is discrete work, but you have many, and the actual work is factored. For instance, it's factored in multiple agents. Each agent can have its own belief, and each agent has its own observations, which are separate. This is a probability P, the agents don't see the state, and so forth. or here you have many variables, and it's exactly that question: how can you possibly scale up? And with computing value functions, there is great ideas actually by Carlos Gestrin, absolute great PhD thesis. But we had the idea that, well, all the people talking about probabilistic inference talk exactly about that. How could you come up with approximations that scale up and exploit factored representations? And in all of these cases, we just did exactly that and showed that it does scale up. So that, for instance, the scaling here with the number of agents is really not, usually it would be next complete, so non-exponentially complete. And here it's, I think we don't have any complexity results, so, but we can actually efficiently solve this just by approximate inference methods. So that's the answer for that first part, where we applied this a lot on these graphical models and these structured representations and so forth. If you ask me about that second part, like the optimal control part, I think scaling is not so hard if a local linear quadratic approximation of the process is okay. But this statement is true for all control methods. You get the Riccati equations; they're quite efficient. You can sometimes use very fast, like matrix inverters, to actually propagate over Riccati equations. They're quite efficient. So it's in robotics, it's standard to solve optimal control problems up to 20 or 40 dimensions. And people should not be so worried about scaling. You know, if it's okay to locally linearize and quadratize the system. If in the continuous space it's high dimensional and multimodal, then yeah, don't have answers.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Okay, if you use your approach for instead of planning, you can use these things also to recognize the action of somebody else. I did it, Arne did it, he did it. But I was thinking if one can discriminate between something like model-free behavior and planning or deliberative behavior using these kind of things. Do you think it's possible to do that?
What you just said, you mean doing this inference about the other person, yes, right? So doing inference about whether the other person does
is
planning,
kind of reactive with the policy prefixed or inference behind it.
That's cool. That's interesting. I've never thought about that. I don't know. A naive answer would be, I'm sure that one can somehow. I mean, you too, right? You formulate graphical models that are models about the other person, like theory of mind kind of thing. And I'm sure that one could, but that's just a naive answer, that one could come up with graphical models where there's two alternatives, modeling the one as a rational or doing probabilistic inference for action selection, and in the other case being just reactive behavior. And then do inference about that, but never done.
Because the point is also you show that both planning and model-free, they optimize the same variable.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's not easy to discriminate. I don't know. Really
even if they optimize the same variable, I think the actual, I don't know, the path to get there, so the optimization path, should be very different, I think. So the way, I mean, even if they would both converge to the optimum and then the behavior would be the same, but the evolution of the behavior during learning would be very different, I think.
So maybe related to this, have you thought about looking at inverse reinforcement learning from this perspective?
No, but actually others, I should cite others. So Bui in particular did like goal inference or policy recognitions, was one of the early ones. And maybe also the Verma, you could think of that as kind of inferring, I don't know, doing sampling, getting data from another person and then inferring what it's actually doing.
So another question, I remember somewhere in the beginning I asked you about the price you pay, right? The assumptions you make to make these analyses work. And one of them is really your assumption about the state space or about how, the distributions of the variables you're sampling and so on. But another one, in your stochastic optimal control approach, you make a very fundamental assumption. It's, okay, future states can be used to set your priors, and in that way you can sort of iterate yourself through a product, right? But this actually also works only on the specific constraints, right? If I'm, for instance, if I'm imagining, let's say, if I have a free system, a system that can freely imagine these future states without any constraints. If I switch these goals too quickly without really iterating through all consequences, I can screw up all my policies. That's an example. If I imagine goal states that are in conflict, I can screw up my policy space and so on. And I feel that, yes, it works beautifully if you really restrict that policy space or the goal space that you can attain. And so it might go a bit in the same direction Hector was asking about, but down a more specific way. So really, what are the constraints I have to impose on that goal space to make this stochastic optimal control really work and robust?
Well, that's a hard question, but first one comment, when you say, when you switch the goals too fast, so you reminds me very much of humans, right? Or if you have too many goals at the same time.
I'm just talking about myself.
Exactly. And
what do you mean exactly?
No.
Don't worry, I'm just kidding.
Sounds very human-like. So one of the things certainly that this whole thing does not answer and is where the goals actually come from. So because that's even that's a difficult discussion. That's even the basis of what people sometimes call of intrinsic reward, or the discussion where do the rewards actually come from, because eventually, of course, in the system they must always be sort of intrinsic, right, or generated by some mechanistic, I don't know, hormone, I don't know.
Miscellaneous magic.
Exactly, and so in here, so in that framework, what it says is that somehow these goals pop up by some random variables suddenly being conditioned in the future, which sounds like a very cognitive thing, right? To me, at least, and that thing I have no idea which other systems should do that.
Exactly,
and it corresponds to that exactly to the problem, like when people ask, but where does the reward function come from in worlds where we know that the goals of the reward functions changed quite a lot?
No, but this is quite an important issue, right? We see that you earlier declared this ambition, like integrated framework, and then we unify all these sciences, right? That in some sense where we are now is still a sort of a small subset that is predicated also on all sort of assumptions of these surrounding systems. This is not a criticism. I mean, this is just to be that we're clear about where we are.
If you consider a hierarchical thing, cannot you infer that the hierarchical, the higher level define the lower level reward, for example?
And where does the higher level get the reward from?
We can
from experience and previous memory and generalization from previous experience.
Life's not that easy. Okay.
We survive.
All right, Marc. Thank you very much. Great talk.